Well, there I stood in the driveway with a handful of greasy pancakes and my mouth open, wondering what the heck I'd saw. What had happened?
Picture a flying saucer landing on Earth. What environment comes to mind? The dry plains of Roswell, New Mexico? The crisp evergreen forests of New Hampshire, where Betty and Barney Hill were abducted? Maybe you've seen a UFO yourself. Odds seem to be higher for those in the state of Wisconsin, America's Dairyland, and the subject of tonight's discussion with Wisconsin native Jeff Finup, host of the Badgerland Legends podcast, who's prepared to expose the strange history of UFOs over Wisconsin, a state that has played an integral role in the study of ufology. Thank you for being here. Let's get on with the show.
Here is where this flying saucer, this UFO landed. Right here about where I'm standing. It was a big, huge thing, and I wondered what the heck it was. I was in my kitchen having a bite of lunch, and I turned around, put the dishes in the sink, and I looked out the window, and that's when I first saw this thing coming straight down, just like an elevator. First I thought the roof went off of my house, and I thought, no, the roof is green, and this is bright. What the heck is it? So I rushed out to see what it was, and by that time, there was a hatchway opening up in the top of it, just like the trunk of your car. And in there stood a little man. I say a little man, about 5 foot tall, holding up a jug, and he motioned he wanted to drink. He motioned for water. So I walked up to him to get this jug, and I looked at his eyes, and they were so penetrating that I had to look away. So I went to the basement to get this water. I thought, well, they want water, so I'll take it up to them and see what happens. And with that, I brought the water up, and he was looking at me when I first came out of the basement. But I didn't look at his face until I got right up to him. Then I looked up, and I handed the jug up with both hands, and I had that same look in his eyes, a sort of a penetrating look. Well, when he took the water, I balanced myself with this hand against the machine, and I stepped back a few steps. With that, he set the jug down, and he gave me a salute with the back of his hand, a gesture of thanks, I presume. I noticed this little man, the same size of a man, right to the right side of the hatchway, cooking these pancakes, which I have one here yet. He didn't say a word. He just reached over and he got a handful of them, 4 of them, and he handed them down to me, and they were hot and greasy. And this, if that was their food, God help them, because I took a bite of one of them, and it tasted like a piece of cardboard.
Ladies and gentlemen, here we are back again on My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. Of course, this is not your typical My Family Thinks I'm Crazy episode. Many of you may remember Esoteric America, a show that Roman, Tara, Chad, and I started and are continuing. And today we're bringing you another episode of Esoteric America. Roman, of course, my lovely co-host, is here. And our guest today, Jeff, will be joining us to talk about the weird history of Wisconsin UFOs. And I love it. I love the timing. I know, Jeff, you probably have been listening to some of the UFO topics that I've been bringing onto the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy show, and you may have even heard me say I want to dive further into this subject because it's always been an interest of mine. So, perfect timing. But before we get to that, Jeff, introduce yourself and tell everybody what we're going to be talking about today. Kick it off. Let's go.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Mark. So my name is Jeff Finup. I'm with Badgerland Legends. I write about the people, places, and things that make Wisconsin legendary. And the topic tonight, as you alluded to, Wisconsin UFOs, a weird history. So we'll get right into it. Wisconsin, it's a small Midwestern state, but it's played an outsized role in the field of ufology and the history of the phenomenon. Now, Wisconsin, it's like right in the middle. It ranks about 25th in landmass and only 20th in population. But it seems like whenever high strangeness is involved, there's some tie to Wisconsin. So where Wisconsin's UFO history starts is where many of, I guess, U.S. UFO history starts. It's with these airship sightings of the 1890s. So the sightings actually started in 1896 on the West Coast. Now, these manned aerial crafts, they were normally spotted in evening or at night. Many were described as bright lights. Some witnesses claimed to see men pedaling the crafts across the sky. Now, this specific Midwest flap that I'm going to be talking about, it started in the spring of 1897. The first one that I've seen documented was in March 10th of 1897, although they started in the fall of 1896 in the San Francisco, Sacramento, that area up there of Northern California. But for the ones we're going to be talking tonight, March 10th of 1897 was when the first one was spotted over Kansas City. And that was March 10th. And then March 20th, a mysterious airship appeared over Omaha, Nebraska. April 2nd, Kalamazoo, Michigan. And then Nashville, Illinois. And then on April 6th, hundreds again witnessed them in Omaha. So on April 8th, we have Wolf Creek, Iowa pop up. So you see kind of they're popping up all throughout the Midwest and not really in a linear fashion. And then until April 9th, one again was seen in Omaha, Nebraska, but also Chicago, Illinois. Now that Chicago is at the time and still is the Midwest most populous city. So when it showed up over Chicago, people really took an interest in the phenomenon. So on April 9th, 1897, an initial crowd gathered on Oakley Street in Chicago's North Side and watched what was described by various witnesses as a red light, a manifestation, and an airship. Huh. Now, eventually, thousands of people saw this ship over Chicago, but it didn't stay in one place. Now, that night, later in the evening, they saw it in Evanston, Illinois. And if you are on YouTube right now, you can see the map that I kind of laid out here. So it traveled north of Chicago to Evanston, Illinois, but then it looks like it kind of took a westward course up towards Madison, Wisconsin, where it was spotted over Lake Mills, and then again north to the Northwoods of Wisconsin.
Right.
So when I was researching this, I was like, well, was this just somebody taking some, editorial license with the facts saying, well, of course, it floated off and then it passed over all these Midwest towns. But I found the next day in the Madison newspaper called the Wisconsin State Journal, still around today, Thursday night at 9:00, a number of reliable people of the village of Lake Mills saw this airship pass over. So it kind of corroborated that story coming out of Chicago, saying that maybe there's something to this phenomenon. Maybe it's not just a bunch of jokers miscategorizing like a celestial body like Venus or the North Star or something like that. So that kind of made me scratch my head. And then the following day, April 10th, Milwaukee. Now, although that Chicago airship on April 9th was tracked heading north to Evanston, then towards Madison, and then to Wausau, which is Wisconsin's North Woods, kind of lost track. I don't think there was more than probably some lumber camps up there at the time. But another ship must have been spotted because the newspapers that morning for the Milwaukee Sentinels, it actually said that airship coming this way. So they saw it in Chicago. Milwaukee caught news of it and actually wrote the headline, "They saw the airship," or "airship coming this way." So Milwaukeeans were primed to look up to the skies, and what do you know? They saw an airship that night. So on the night of April 10th, 1897, Milwaukee had a visitation. Witnesses all over Milwaukee looked to the skies and they saw what they described as an airship. They called it an airship because the term flying saucer won't be invented for another 50 years. And it was actually spotted by a downtown police officer while he was standing on Broadway in Milwaukee's downtown. He described the airship as looking like 4 bright stars put together. It flashed the colors of white, red, and green, although a local astronomer argued the airship may be only a star. This policeman, he stood firm on his story. He claimed that the craft dipped and bobbed wildly several times before it sped off. So it seems like there was something to these events. Now we get to Madison the next day. So it sounds like one passed over on the 9th and the 10th in Milwaukee. Another one pops up on the 11th. And then it said a great many Madisonians were confident they saw the airship last night. This was a headline that ran in the local paper. It said, brilliant lights are reported, especially by those with opera glasses. Now, I like that detail because it just kind of shows the times. You see kind of these, the Victorian era people standing on the lakeshore, looking up over Lake Mendota. If you've ever been to Madison, it's on an isthmus. And the northernmost lake, the largest lake in Madison, is called Mendota. And you could just see people looking up and seeing this airship, putting on their opera glasses and getting a closer look. But it says that the local observatory, which would probably have been the University of Madison at the time, or Wisconsin at Madison, wasn't enthusiastic about it. They dismissed it as people seeing stars. They said the brightest star at the time was Jupiter, Venus, and Sirius. Of course, we know Jupiter and Venus as planets now, but I think they just categorized all celestial bodies as stars at the time. So they said that these stars are celestial bodies. They don't jiggle up and down to the extent, but that perhaps the gazers saw the lights of streamers or kites on Lake Mendota. But then the paper also says that, well, it's not yet boating season on Mendota. So it wasn't people out boating on the Madison Lakes, flying kites with lights on them. So it's kind of hard to say, oh yeah, that's definitely was the phenomenon. But many people of Madison witnessed it, and we're not sure what to think of it.
Now, with
So
these,
the boating or the kites with the lights, this was kind of a common occurrence that was happening back in the 1900s?
I'm not sure about that, but that was just one of the plausible skeptical interpretations, was like, oh, they must have just attached lanterns to the tails of their kites and floated up there.
How much detail or descriptive language is used in these reports? Because for the most part, I've heard lights being described, but when I see maybe like the concept of airships or even, pictures of them from, artist depictions, they look like sailboats in the sky, right? But is that what people are describing, or is that a way that people conceptualized a flying vehicle in their time? Like, what did they actually see? What we saw in, like, obviously in this, what was it, the first slide that you showed, that was an artist's depiction of a flying airship, but is that necessarily what people are seeing, or are they just seeing a light and because it's moving, calling it a ship in the air?
So some people said, in Milwaukee, they said it came close enough that they thought about anchoring it to the city hall there, which was actually the tallest inhabited building in the country at the time, was the Milwaukee City Hall. So, and people said that some people described seeing occupants in them. Some people said they just saw like empty interiors. The accounts, they were widely, described, everything from just, 4 lights blinking red, white, and green to actually seeing like occupants pedaling through the sky. And like you said, Mark, the literature, shows these depictions of almost like boats, or like, the envelope of an air balloon underneath it with occupants. But the craziest one comes out of the Minneapolis Daily Times. So this is probably the most thorough description that I've read so far, and I have it up here on the screen for you all to read. But the Minneapolis Daily Times ran this story about an airship anchoring in Rice Lake. Rice Lake is like it was probably like a lumbering community at the time. It's Wisconsin's Northwoods. And it says that the airship actually anchored in Rice Lake, and the crew called for a physician. The distinguished patient, the captain, was suffering an acute attack of la grippe. Now, I had never heard of this, so I looked it up, and it's some form of Russian influenza that's still going around today. So after a couple of hours, the captain insisted that the doctor continue on the journey on the airship with them. So they called this doctor, and they actually name him in the article, Dr. J.P. Valby. So it says that he boarded the ship. He brought his instruments with him. He went to administer treatment on the doctor, which I believe lasted an hour. And then the doctor, he wanted to depart the ship and get on with his night. But he was held at rifle point. Well, a tussle ensued, and the doctor wrestled the rifle away. Now, the ship at the time had already set sail and was about 40 feet into the air when the doctor bailed with the rifle that he wrestled away from the assailant and landed in a pond where he was later rescued. It says in the article that he kept the rifle, but the airship continued on its way with the doctor's medical equipment on board. So there is, I guess, kind of to answer your initial question about the description, this is probably the most fantastical account that I found.
Oh, yeah.
And also the most descriptive.
I asked because, a lot of times people will talk about like modern UFOs and say, oh, it's not a modern phenomena. Look, there's history of this kind of thing going on, going back into ancient times, people seeing things in the sky. But this, to me, I think shows possibly a different, maybe separate or loosely connected phenomena where you have people using flying craft before the rest of the population knows what these vehicles are. Because how else would they have things like rifles, and why would they need something like medical equipment if they weren't human beings, right? Like it just, to me, and again, we don't have to entertain this theory completely. I just want to throw this out there. This sounds a lot like a breakaway civilization to me. Why else would they need a doctor? And I mean, if they were space aliens, they definitely wouldn't have rifles. At least
they would have some other kind of advanced weapon, not a rifle of the time. And the interesting thing about this article, and you can look it up, either on the YouTube video or Minneapolis Daily Times. I found it on newspapers.com from April 13th of 1897, where it names the doctor, it names the people that rescued the doctor. It's a very descriptive article with lots of details. So if somebody had, the more sleuthing capabilities or the willingness to actually look in to see, okay, was this doctor actually practicing medicine, and try to corroborate this? And, if they could track down this gun, I'd love to see, what's the maker's mark on it? When was it manufactured? Where was it from? And just kind of to corroborate this. So just to kind of wrap up the airship phenomenon, skeptics, they concluded that people were just being predisposed to popular literature of the time. Now, the ironic part, or maybe coincidental part, is H.G. Wells' classic, The War of the Worlds, was serialized in Cosmopolitan in the U.S. and Pearson's Magazine in England in April of 1897. So War of the Worlds came out at the same month, but it was serialized. So they would release chapters of the book in these popular magazines that people would buy. And then once that ran, then they put it together as a whole novel. So that was kind of interesting to see, kind of correlated. So it definitely showed that the public had an appetite for flying machines and visitors from another world, but that Omaha sightings that I laid out in early March that would have predated the release of this specific War of the Worlds thing. So that wouldn't have necessarily had influence on it, but there was other literature of this flying ship and phenomenon kind of percolating through the culture already. So it wasn't a completely alien concept, no pun intended. So
that's really interesting, especially with the H.G. Wells tie in there at the end. That this time period is, in fact, getting to the point where we're starting to, have more like sci-fi be normalized, or these ideas and concepts come out. But H.G. Wells, that man was connected, right? When War of the Worlds was read on the radio,
that was by Orson Welles, no relation, another Wisconsin man, ironically.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes, Orson Welles did that, and I think that was in the 1930s, but I have to check my notes on that.
For H.G. Wells, to keep him in the frame, he wrote a book called The Shape of Things to Come in 1933, which talks about a great war destroying Europe, and then a plague comes, and then a benevolent dictator, sets up paving a way for world peace. And right here on the Wikipedia, it mentions how, though this is a work of fiction, several of Wells' short-term predictions from The Shape of Things to Come would come true, such as the aerial bombings of whole cities, which was presented in more detail than in his previous book, The War in the Air, and the eventual development of weapons of mass destruction. So here we go, having a author, just so happens to imagine this idea of, air forces being this major weapon to rule the world. What if he wasn't predicting things? What if he knew about this breakaway civilization that had mastered air flight, before anyone else had, and had been using that to subvert governments? I mean, it could explain why all the nations came to join the UN. I mean, who's behind the UN? Maybe it's this breakaway civilization. But anyways,
it's an interesting concept, and they do call them extraterrestrials, which indicates extra territory. So maybe there is some extra territory that this breakaway civilization comes from, and that's why we weren't privy to the technology. So air balloons as a method of traveling, it dates back to 1783 in France, and the actual airship phenomenon, like steam-powered ships, was the mid-1800s. So this wasn't completely foreign technology, but for people to see it in mass, it definitely was. It was something to behold. So we could speculate all night on it, and I love that, but so many conclusions can be drawn from it. So 1897, it was an auspicious year because the Yerkes Observatory in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, right on the shores of Geneva Lake, was opened. Now it opened, let's see here. It's been called the birthplace of modern astrophysics, and it had the largest refracting telescope in the world at the time. Now, what's important to our story tonight is that it was one of the employees there at the facility in 1932 was a gentleman by the name of J. Allen Hynek. Now, he's known today as the father of ufology, but when he was working there, he was a PhD candidate. So from his biography, and they called it the Close Encounters Man is the name of his biography, and pulled a quote from there.
That's a pretty sweet, high-ranking biography name right there. I'm not gonna lie.
That's awesome. And that was because of his role in Project Blue Book. The cases that he studied most closely were of close encounters. So this in 1932, he's a PhD student. He's fresh out of his undergrad. He's coming to this observatory. It's a remote observatory. It's across the lake from Lake Geneva. For those that don't know about Lake Geneva, it is just north of Chicago. It's where a lot of the Chicago bigwigs, the moneyed people, would build their vacation homes. Well, they built this observatory right on the lake in Williams Bay, which is across the lake. The town is called Lake Geneva. The lake is called Geneva Lake. It's kind of confusing, but that's the long and the short of it. So a quote from that book is, you go to this observatory with just a few other people there, and you feel like you might be a monk looking at the heavens, learning the secrets of the universe. You can see how that would have a spiritual feeling in the right personality. Night after night, under the 90-foot main dome, Hynek peered into the firmament, studying the ancient light given off by distant yellow and white dwarf stars, and forgetting that anything else ever existed or ever would. Science and mysticism came together every night in the eyepiece of his telescope. Time vanished, dimensions contracted. The whole thing has sort of a mystical quality to it. And then Hynek later confessed that one shouldn't say that in connection with science, I guess. So he's kind of lamenting the fact that at the time they're trying to separate science from mysticism, science from any spiritual realm. They're trying to kind of separate it on its own. And he's seeing the connections between, both the modern day science of astrophysics and then the old kind of art of astrology and studying the sky clock and the sky patterns and kind of the mythologies that's been crafted onto the sky. So in Hynek's formative years, he read Rudolf Steiner and was admittedly an acolyte of Manly P. Hall. He was also a member of Heindel's Rosicrucian Society, where he enrolled into a course to get a $100 book at the time, which was a lot of money in 1932. And a lot of his colleagues said, "You're paying $5 a month to get a book. Why don't you just go and buy a motorcycle like the rest of us?" So it's kind of a funny aside to think he's nerdy. He's geeking out on this esoteric literature in 1932. And we'll get into kind of the Hynek and the Blue Book stuff in a little bit here, because he really weaves through the entire narrative of kind of Wisconsin ufology and the story that's about to unfold.
So you said he was because Steiner was around at this time. So was he bumping shoulders with Steiner and the Theosophical Society, or was he just a fan of his work? He was a fan of the work. He was he sent away for that Rosicrucian text, and then he was also reading Manly P. Hall's The Secret Teaching of All Ages, and he was reading Steiner stuff as well. So he was kind of immersed in the literature as a grad student and a PhD candidate. And it's kind of funny seeing how he has been characterized as the debunker and the skeptic and the guy that just wants the facts on the UFOs. But then he's got kind of the secret knowledge or the secret history of looking into kind of more mystical text and theosophical text. And so some people said that he was a theosophist. I haven't found anything to confirm that, but he was definitely into the esoteric works, by Steiner and Hall. It it was definitely going around at this time. This time period is just thick of in the thick of it. Right before the wars, it was like there was so much great work coming out. Yeah, and that's really cool. One of the quotes is, because this was the period, it was after the Great War, leading up to World War II. And it was kind of a time of peace, but I think there was also a lot of inklings like, okay, well, we know that one war can start. What about another one? And then he said in a quote that he had immersed himself so much in his studies that he, in 1932, he had barely even heard of Hitler. And that was kind of the rise of the Nazi party during that time. But he was immersed in his literature and studying the sky and working on his PhD. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting kind of look behind the man that we look at as the father of ufology. So we talked about the father of ufology. Now let's trace the maternal bloodline of ufology. Somebody that doesn't get a lot of play, but I think is due. Her name is Coral Lorenzon. So she was just a young girl of 9
when she witnessed what she described as an open umbrella without the ribs or spurs fly silently across the summer skies of Barron, Wisconsin. Now, she was 9 years old, young girl, northwoods of Wisconsin, not too far from that Rice Lake where that abduction happened. And she had witnessed this along with one of her playmates. Now, she went to report it, and, nothing was ever made of it, because what are they going to say? And, at that time, when she saw this, she, I think this was in the 1930s, commercial flights in that area were not a thing. Even if a monoplane flew by, that was like an occasion, like everybody, oh, did you see the plane today? And she sees this thing that she calls an open umbrella without the ribs or spurs flying silently across the sky. So it was something very bizarre to a young girl, and it got her hooked at a young age. So in 1952, she was in her late 20s at the time. She saw another aerial phenomenon, and that was in Sturgeon Bay when she was looking out over Lake Michigan. Now, Sturgeon Bay is kind of north of Green Bay. It's between the peninsula of Door County and mainland Wisconsin. And she witnessed a metallic object with bright red glow, with a bright red glow emanating from the bottom of the craft just above the streets of Sturgeon Bay. So that same year, she had the encounter. She decided to organize a aerial phenomenon research organization, and she called it APRO. And the organization was dedicated to the study of these phenomenons, the unidentified objects. So she used scientific scrutiny when she collected these cases and these eyewitnesses. It said specifically in a couple of the articles I read that she abhorred crackpots and cranks. So she was very much, I want to know just the facts. I don't want to hear about little green men. I don't want to hear about anything fantastical. I want to know what she said, as cleanly and clearly as you can say it. So this is 1953, and you think it's right after World War II. It's the lead up to the Cold War, and they actually open a civilian observation tower in Sturgeon Bay, and she's a member of this civilian ground observation corps, where her and a group of civilians, they take shifts at this lookout tower, watching the skies and reporting what they see. And the main thing was they were worried about the Soviets. So they wanted to know what was going on in the skies over there. So there was a real military strategic purpose to the civilian corps. But Coral, she was kind of canny lady. She wanted to see UFOs. So that was kind of her smokescreen was, oh yeah, we need to watch out for the Soviets. But she wanted to see what was actually happening in the skies above Sturgeon Bay. So APRO, it continued to grow. It added regional branches in many states across the country. And then in 1969, the Midwest UFO Network was formed. And they had thought that the Coral Lorenzon and her Jim, who was I think he was in the Air Corps at the time, they moved out to the desert in Tucson and kind of abandoned the Midwest. So they said, well, Coral, she's out in the desert, so we need to start our own thing. So the Midwest UFO Network became the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, which we know today is kind of at the leading edge of the investigation of this phenomenon as far as on a civilian basis. So that was started by a guy named Alan Utke, who was a professor at Wisconsin State University, which is now the University of Milwaukee. So lots of tie-ins from, Coral Lorenzon. We got J. Allen Hynek, and now we got Alan Utke out of Milwaukee, starting all of these UFO networks to study the phenomenon, all out of Wisconsin. Now, 1947.
That is really fascinating, by the way. I just wanted to plug that in there, that I had no idea that Wisconsin was so deeply connected, especially with MUFON. I mean, that is a huge deal. Yeah. Right now, MUFON, I mean, whatever type of flack that they get, and
Mhm.
from the community or whatever, I've used as a resource when looking into a lot of these stories. And I've spoken with a fantastic author who's, he works directly with MUFON. So to know that it came directly out of Wisconsin, mind blown. Had no idea.
Yeah, it's crazy. And,
Cool.
We did a podcast on this for the Wisconsin Legends podcast. We did a 2-parter on UFOs, and doing the research on this and kind of digging deeper into this stuff. I was really surprised at how many things in popular mainstream ufology tied directly back to Wisconsin. So I just thought it was noteworthy to mention that. Yeah, everything kind of leads back to Wisconsin.
I think it definitely, the idea of a UFO conjures images of deserts, maybe because of Roswell. You naturally, when you think of a UFO, you might think of it over like a desert sort of setting.
I think of Art Bell doing his radio program at midnight in the desert, looking over the skies and seeing stuff come in from Area 51. And yeah, definitely Roswell. And then you think the deserts of Arizona, south of Phoenix, you have like the Superstition Mountains.
But my point is not to bring up how cool deserts are. Is all of that happened, sure, but what was it? Roswell happened around this time, maybe a little bit after, but it didn't become mainstream popular knowledge until the 70s. So even though all this was happening in this era, it was it was kind of like a small town club kind of thing. So yeah, that is really fascinating to hear that Wisconsin State University had something to do with MUFON. I mean, I wouldn't have expected that at all.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then you mentioned Roswell. Put a pin in that, because we'll actually get back to Roswell and kind of the popularization of that and how Wisconsin was involved in that as well. So we'll fast forward a little bit to 1947. This is kind of the advent of the flying saucer area. On June 24th, 1947, Kenneth Arnold, he was a private pilot. He was flying his aircraft and he saw a string of 9 shiny objects flying past Mount Rainier. Now, he was an experienced pilot, and he had estimated that the speed of these objects was 1,200 miles per hour. Now, just to put that into context, it wasn't until 4 months later, October 14th, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier at 670.84 miles per hour. That was the speed limit at the time, or the speed record, 1.05, which was almost half of the speed of 1,200 miles per hour. So we know that looking back, Chuck Yeager did that it was a secret mission at the time. It wasn't publicized. So we know that was probably the maximum of the U.S. military's capabilities as far as speed goes, was going hypersonic 4 months after June 24th, 1947, when Kenneth Arnold saw these crafts. So that's just to kind of put a finer point in it. What were these things? It kind of beckons back to Mark's assertion about maybe this is breakaway civilization. Well, that leads right into the next topic. So after that sighting at Mount Rainier, Washington, just north of Seattle there, Milwaukee native Ray Palmer reached out to Kenneth Arnold and bought that story.
Hey-o.
So Palmer, he was working as an editor for a kind of a pulp newsstand magazine called Amazing Story. He had worked at Amazing Stories for years, and then once he got a hold of the Kenneth Arnold material and bought his story and got him on record, he decided to start his own publication, and he called that Fate Magazine. So Volume 1, Issue 1 of Fate Magazine featured Arnold's story in full detail, recounting his sightings. So the fact that Arnold's story was preserved and published was thanks to Milwaukee man Raymond Palmer. Now, before that sighting, Palmer had been writing about flying saucers and visitors from other worlds So when he heard about Arnold's sighting, as well as sightings leading up to that kind of flying saucer area, he got excited. It was like the stories that he was editing and he was publishing were coming to life in his own reality. So for his involvement in this early flying saucer craze, including writing on UFO cover-ups, Men in Black, Palmer was offhandedly dubbed the man who invented flying saucers by none other than John Keel. So he was really the man at the forefront of the modern concept of UFO belief. Now, he eventually moved from Chicago to a small community called Amherst, Wisconsin. Now, unless you're from central Wisconsin, where I grew up, you don't know where Amherst is on a map. I actually grew up about 20 miles from Amherst. I worked within 5 miles of Amherst, and I worked with people from Amherst. But I did not know about Ray Palmer until a couple years ago, when one of my friends decided to start making a documentary on the man. Now, you might not recognize the name Ray Palmer, but you may recognize the Shaver Mysteries. Richard Sharp Shaver was an associate of Palmer's, and Ray Palmer is the reason that we know about Richard Sharp Shaver and the Shaver Mystery. So that kind of ties that together. And he wrote with Richard, living in Amherst at the time, little town in Wisconsin, all about Richard Shaver and what he found in these caverns with the Lemurians and all of this kind of esoteric breakaway civilization knowledge. Now, I'm not sure how much of this Ray Palmer believed, but it was enough to sell magazines. And once he put Richard Shaver's stories on the covers, it really exploded. And that was when he was with Amazing Stories. But then later, he also worked with Palmer, also worked with Shaver and also Kenneth Arnold on other projects. So they were kind of a trio putting out a lot of this material and kind of giving some shape and form to the flying saucer craze of this era. So just yet another kind of tie into Wisconsin, flying saucers, and ufology.
I see Connecticut native Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, and Halley's Comet there on the cover. That kind of piqued my interest.
I did not. I thought Samuel Clemens was of Hannibal, Missouri.
No, Mark Twain's from Connecticut.
Is that right? Okay, because I thought he was a boy growing up on the banks of the Mississippi.
Well, that's the character, but I think he left Connecticut and worked in Mississippi. Yeah.
Okay.
But
all right.
But yeah, no, he's a Connecticut guy. He's got the Mark Twain house in the state capitol. Yes. But
interesting.
Yeah, I love this era of like pulp fiction, and kind of blurred the lines between science fiction and fact, and yeah, it's something that.
And I think the reason that Palmer might not get his due as far as modern day ufology is because he wrote a lot of fantastical stuff, and he was on the cutting edge of like the science fiction and in the fantasy stuff, and he was kind of in the kind of that crease, that fun crease between fiction and reality. So I think people were willing to dismiss him as just like a fantasy publisher or fantasy author, even though he really shaped a lot of the perception. So that's probably why we don't know about Ray Palmer. But my friend Dean Bertram is doing a documentary. It should be out this coming year in 2024, all about the Shaver Mystery and Raymond Palmer. And the working title of that project is called The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers. So I can't wait to get a copy of that, and I'll get you in touch with him, Mark, once he gets that out, because I think that would make for a fascinating discussion.
And you're right about Twain. I stand corrected here. He was born in Missouri, moved to Connecticut.
Okay.
But I guess Connecticut, they love him so much. I just had this impression that he was always from Connecticut and just wrote all this stuff about, places he'd traveled to. But no, he's from Missouri.
Okay.
You're right.
Well, he straddles the line, Connecticut adopted the Missouri Sun as their own, and they kept his house, and so that's cool that he kind of straddles both lines.
Yeah.
So has anybody ever seen this picture before?
No.
What do we got going on here?
On Tuesday, April 18th, 1961, Joe Simonton, a plumber from Eagle River, Wisconsin, again, Wisconsin's North Woods, he may have entered into an intergalactic barter. Shortly before noon, a saucer-shaped craft described as silver, brighter than chrome, hovered just above ground level at his property. An occupant, small in stature, disembarked. He was dressed in a black two-piece suit. The occupant motioned to Simonton by holding up a jug, indicating that he desired it to be filled with water. After filling the jug and returning to the ship, a different occupant handed him 3 cakes, described as 1/4 inch thick and 3 or 4 inches in diameter. Were they space pancakes? The cakes were sent to the National Committee for the Investigation of Aerial Phenomenon in Washington, D.C. According to a later account, the committee was returning the pancakes without analysis. So after receiving countless media requests, as well as written letters, the plumber quipped, "If it happened again, I don't think I'd tell anyone about it." Now, Simonton's encounter piqued the interest of Project Blue Book, and consultant J.on Hynek came up to the Northwoods to investigate the pancakes, and he actually got a sample of one and tested it. It was a normal wheat germ pancake, nothing too supernatural or extraterrestrial about it, but it was a curious thing that happened in the Northwoods. Now, later, Hynek actually sat down and had a conversation with Jacques Vallée, of all people, and a friend kind of mediated the conversation and recorded it. And he talked about Joe Simonton, and he thought that he was a sole witness, so credibility was in question. But when Hynek went up there to investigate Simonton, he had thought that he was telling the truth about what happened. Now, he ascribed it the Magonia syndrome, where these things, this phenomenon, appear to people, and they are similar to what somebody can relate to. Like, I think a lot of times they call them screen memories. It's something that people can conceptualize, but it's still kind of a step out of the ordinary. So he thought that what Simonton encountered on his property in Eagle River, doing this exchange of these pancakes, was something that was real. And he also alluded to that a lot of time in the fairy lore. These little goblins or trolls or whatever would give people these little cakes, these little wafer cakes. And that kind of looks like what Joe Simonton is holding in his hand in that photograph. So it's an interesting story. He got mostly ridicule. He didn't get fame or fortune for this. And like he said, if it happened again, he doesn't think he'd tell anybody. So I think that kind of led some credibility to something happened on his farm this morning or that morning. And what it was, it's really hard to say.
Wow.
That's really fascinating. Pancakes, like, just of all things, they're wheat germ pancakes, and they're burnt. That looks burnt.
It was burnt like a crisp. And he actually said he tried it and it tasted very bland.
Maybe that's why they go and make these crop circles. That's how they harvest their grain, from the crop circles, and then they create little pancakes.
Yeah, and then they abduct cows, and then they got the dairy so they can have the buttermilk, and they got the wheat so they can make pancakes to hand to unsuspecting plumbers in the north woods of Wisconsin. Yeah. Seems like plausible to me.
It's all adding up. Now, this photo kind of looks like AI art to me. It's not purported to be a real photo of the event.
No. So this is the foreground image is of Simonton. This is a historical picture of him holding the pancake. overlaid on an AR generated art.
Okay, cool. Well,
Yeah,
now I
yeah.
get why you asked us if we had seen the photo before, because at first I was like, no, is this a movie or something? No.
I'm sorry. I meant
It's all right.
the photo in the foreground of
Right.
him holding the pancake from outer space.
Great slide, by the way. This is a
Thanks. I stole this one from, I believe I was on a Reddit thread, so I can't take full credit for it, but I thought it was compelling enough to drop into this presentation.
Yeah. No, it's cool.
So, just real quick on this pancake, just back to the beginning. He had helped him out with water, and in turn for the water, he got gifted just one of these pancakes.
It was 3 pancakes.
And they all 3 got tested, or was it just the one that got tested?
I believe they took one for testing.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's so funny. And
yeah,
strange.
and I found a whole packet on this, and they actually had like the spectrographic analysis of the pancakes, and it was just normal wheat germ pancake. I heard other stories saying that, it didn't contain salt, which was weird because everything on Earth contains salt, but I couldn't corroborate that. It didn't seem like there was anything out of the ordinary about the specific contents of this. And then, the guy that was mediating the conversation between Hynek and Jacques Vallée said, I'm curious, like, did they test it against like a sample of like Aunt Jemima pancake mix? And they said, well, they didn't get that in depth. They just determined it was normal wheat germ that you would find, on any specific pancake or flour mix. So there wasn't anything too out of the ordinary. So it didn't lend any credence to it, but then it also didn't detract from it. So it was kind of indeterminate. But an interesting story, and to hear J. Allen Hynek, kind of this skeptic or debunker, say that he thought that Simonton was telling the truth and that he was a credible witness to this, was quite compelling. So now we'll get into the actual man that we've been talking about this whole time, J. Allen Hynek. We talked about him working at Yerkes Observatory, earning his PhD. We covered his esoteric inclinations when it comes to Steiner, Hall, Heindel, and then the revelations. They hardly match up to this hard-nosed researcher and debunker that we picture as kind of the forward face of Project Blue Book. So he had operated as a consultant from 1952 to 69 in the Air Force's Project Blue Book. He also participated in 2 previous programs called Project Sign and Project Grudge. And those were also kind of aerial phenomenon or UFO research committees. So his involvement in Project Blue Book cast that narrative that he was this ardent skeptic and chief debunker. In fact, he was the progenitor of the swamp gas hypothesis. He shilled that thing to no end. And I think that was on the insistence of the U.S. Air Force to say, we can explain these sightings as swamp gas being combusted in the atmosphere, and that's what these people are seeing. But that really doesn't hold account to a lot of the sightings that happened around that time. Now, we're going to talk about a specific flap that happened, I believe, in 1966. It started in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which migrated westward into Wisconsin. Now, during this flap, one traffic officer from Monroe County even followed an aerial object for 70 miles and eventually losing sight of it. And I'm not sure how swamp gas can travel 70 miles, but that was the hand-waving explanation provided by Hynek and company. Now, critics, they dubbed Project Blue Book as the Society for the Explanation of the Uninvestigated. They pretty much concluded that it was their way of either covering up military technology, off-planet technology, extraterrestrial technology, or redirecting serious inquiries into intellectual cul-de-sacs. So that was kind of the critical analysis of Blue Book. And I think Hynek, he likely traded the role of being a debunker in the hopes of actually gaining the knowledge about what was happening in the skies above. So I think he was happy to take on that role. I can debunk it, but then I also get a front row seat to a lot of this information. And now we talked about his esoteric leanings. That's certainly something that, that points to him carrying a set of both public facing opinions that he aired out through Project Blue Book. And then there was kind of the secret way that he really felt about these phenomenons. And a lot of accounts say that, when he first started this in, the early 50s, that he was skeptical of everything. And then by the end of that term with Blue Book, there was enough leftover evidence where he was more of a believer in the phenomenon. So I found that interesting. And then after Blue Book shuttered, and some people believe that it didn't close officially, it just went away and then went into a more secret department within the Air Force. So they didn't really let the prying eyes of academia or citizen scientists really look into the aerial phenomenon. They wanted to keep it specifically to the ranks of the military. So after he left Blue Book, once it shuttered, he founded the Center for UFO Studies. Now, I've heard this acronym, CUFOs, pronounced two ways. I've heard it pronounced CUFOs and SUFOs, and if I switch between the two, I apologize. But he founded it in 1973. This was a few years after Project Blue Book shuttered. Now, this was a serious scientific investigation into the study of UFOs. It was based in Chicago, near Northwestern, where he was a professor, and it had multiple chapters around, including one in Milwaukee. Now, CUFOs, it had two principal activities. First, it was to maintain a library and archive of UFO-related materials. And then secondly, it was to compile and analyze reports of UFOs. Now, CUFOs is still in operation. They have a pretty extensive website. A lot of the Simonton stuff I pulled off of CUFOs.org. So it's worth checking out, digging around in there, because they really hold up to that first principle of maintaining a library and archive a lot of this material and compiling it into like downloadable PDF format. So anybody can take a look at it and learn more about UFO history. So I thought that was an interesting kind of transition for him from the U.S. Air Force into more of a private open source organization. So I have to commend him for that, for at least getting this off the ground and still going to this day.
It definitely seems like, the UFO community has some shadier elements. I'll admit I don't know much about J. Allen Hynek, but points for leaving the government sector, to pursue this research in an independent way, right? Because it seems like even in the independent sectors, there's some weirdness going on with the UFO community.
Yeah, and it's so hard today looking at any of this stuff and applying any scrutiny to it, because you're like, oh, who is just a bullshitter trying to sell books and who's an actual serious investigator? I feel like, Hynek, when he worked as the role for Blue Book, he was that debunker. He was that face, that the forward-facing guy to say, hand waving like, oh, this is nothing. This is swamp gas. This is ball lightning or some other kind of atmospheric phenomenon. Oh, you just saw Venus, or it could have been a meteorite or whatever, to still having a thirst for this and getting into more of the private sector of compiling this stuff. And I think they've done, at least the people that run it now, a pretty sound job of trying to separate the wheat from the chaff and be more of a scientific, other than, the other thing that we talk about on the program is on the podcast is the stuff coming out of California about getting in touch, channeling space brothers and aliens coming down from other planets and giving material and taking pictures and trying to sell them and stuff. Some of the Georgia Damsky stuff, that is a lot more questionable, where CUFO seems to be more on the straight and narrow as far as a legitimate scientific study of the phenomenon. So Wisconsin has 3 self-styled UFO capitals. It has Elmwood, Belleville, and Long Lake. So I'll start out with Elmwood because I think it is the most compelling. Now, Elmwood is considered the UFO capital of Wisconsin and the flying saucer capital of the world. Although today it's kind of celebrated for fun, kind of in jest and kind of in mocking, there was one encounter that happened in this small Northwoods town that left a police officer very shaken. Now, this was April 22nd, 1976. Police officer George Wheeler, a 30-year law enforcement veteran, came upon a flaming orange object. He said it was about 250 feet across and large as a 2-story building. It was hovering above the ground, and he said he could see shadowy figures inside. During the observation of this aerial phenomenon, Wheeler's radio went dead, and he was found in his police car later that evening. The car's spark plugs and its ignition points were burnt out, and nearby residents even reported that their television sets went off for about 10 minutes about that same time that Wheeler had the encounter. Now, Wheeler said he had been struck by a bluish-white light which came from the craft. He developed severe headaches several days later and was hospitalized for further testing. Now, his chief, by the name of Gene Helmer, said that he had never seen Wheeler as shaken as he was that night of the sighting. George saw something, all right, or he would never have shut off his squad car's engine nor kept the lights off except under extreme circumstances. He wasn't the only person to see a UFO that night. An administrator for a nursing home also witnessed the sighting that happened late at night. So here we have physical evidence, again, of some kind of encounter with something otherworldly or of other high technology. Now, when I hear about that, how it struck the car and I guess it killed the engine, it burnt out the ignition points and the spark plugs, pretty much burnt up the electrical system. It sounds like some kind of either EMP or some kind of energy weapon that struck his car, and it left him incapacitated and resulted in headaches. So it seems like there was something serious that happened to George Wheeler on that night, but that wasn't his only encounter. It was reported that just a year earlier, on April 7th of 75, he saw another object like the previous one, or the one that we talked about previously. So this was the initial encounter that I'm talking about now. It was also a flaming orange. It was about the size of a football field. And Wheeler said that he saw it and it looked like there was a hose dangling from underneath the craft. Now, he surmised that it may have been some kind of charging port or some kind of charging mechanism because he saw it near a 69,000 volt power line. So after that second encounter that we talked about where he was struck, Wheeler concluded whatever it was, they were out to kill us. So he thought they had malintent. And I see how he could have gathered that, considering what happened to him in that patrol car that night. Now, despite the mortal danger that was inflicted to George Wheeler by these objects, Elmwood still holds a UFO Days for a full weekend every July because Wisconsinites like to party. So if it's over a UFO encounter from 1976, they'll tie one on and have a great time. So that's kind of the culture, but I was surprised to find such a compelling event happened to spawn on these UFO Days that they celebrate every year.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I didn't realize that there was such a hotbed right there in the heart of America, at least the northern half, and we've talked about Wisconsin when you were on the show before. We talked a little bit about this, but mostly we mentioned the paranormal, political, conspiratorial, historical aspects of Wisconsin. And when Chad was on the show as a guest, he discussed many anomalies going on in Michigan, but, you know, there's no skirting around the fact that the Great Lakes are a big part of what makes Wisconsin, Michigan, right? I mean, the Great Lakes are a huge part of the economies of both states, you know, the international trade that goes on through those ports. So, I mean, it's probably, I mean, again, we don't want to make any conclusions, but my mind goes to the lake, and I wonder if these are, you know, again, not flying objects from outer space, but maybe deep underground bases that have, you know, entrances underneath the water in these lakes, you know. Do any of your reports, I mean, there were the flying ships by, I forget if it was over, it wasn't over the Great Lakes, but it was over a smaller lake. But
Well, yeah, that one in Rice Lake. Yeah, right. So that was it's a small Northwoods Lake, but Chicago right there on the tip of Lake Michigan. Milwaukee is also right next to Lake Michigan. And then they said they saw them in Green Bay, which is Lake Michigan as well. And that actually segues into the next UFO capital, which is right near the shores of Lake Michigan. It's on a small lake called Long Lake, which is a little more inland lake, but not far from what we call the Michigan Triangle, which I know the connection point is in Manitowoc on the Wisconsin side. I don't know my geography of Michigan well enough to tell you where the 2 points in Michigan where they meet, but there is this area of Lake Michigan, now that you mention it, Mark, that has been a hotbed of paranormal activity. It has a ton of sunken ship over the years, and then UFO sightings, and then also downed aircraft as well, right there on Lake Michigan. So, yeah, it's a huge freshwater lake. It's responsible for so much industry and commerce with the shipping and connecting it. Like you said, you know, Michigan and Wisconsin, they can be defined, you know, literally and figuratively by their Great Lakes, because Michigan is a peninsula and it's surrounded by Great Lakes on all sides. And Wisconsin, you know, the major coastline of the eastern side is all Lake Michigan. And then parts of it, there's parts to Superior, although a lot of that's obscured by Upper Michigan, which is on Lake Michigan, but all part of that. And one interesting UFO sighting that we covered, I believe, in Esoteric America, and I think Chad has also touched on it, was the Kinross incident in Sault Ste. Marie that resulted in the missing aircraft that was marshaled out of Madison's Air Force Base and stationed in Sault Ste. Marie to protect the border there with Canada. And if you actually look at the pilot's memorial marker, they never found the plane. It said downed by UFO. So kind of another tie-in, kind of that Michigan-Wisconsin UFO connection right there on the Great Lakes, on a Great Lakes port in Sault Ste. Marie. So to tie it all together, yeah, that's definitely it. And then to get back to this specific one on Long Lake, Bill Benson, he was the late owner of a little place called Benson's Hideaway. You see it there. Bill Benson, Wisconsin legend, 1942 to his death date in 2021. So he's been gone a couple years now. But he ran this barn restaurant, which was situated on the edge of Long Lake, which has been contended to be an area of high strangeness. Now, in 1985, multiple witnesses came forward after seeing a circular object hovering above a farm field, startling a herd of cows. You know how flying saucers love dairy cows. We got lots of cows in Wisconsin, so maybe that's why we got a lot of UFOs. So after that incident garnered attention, Benson and his buddy Bob Keene, aka UFO Bob, decided to start their first ever UFO Daze, DAZE. But the activity didn't end there. In 1995, a crop circle was discovered near Long Lake. In 1998, Benson, along with 5 others, witnessed a large orange ball hovering over Dundee Mountain. As they observed the orb 4 fighter jets were scrambled after the aerial apparition. Now, many UFO enthusiasts contend that Dundee Mountain, the small mountain just on the north side of Long Lake, is home to a secret UFO base. Now, that sounds like some kind of crank assertions there, but what you said, Mark, maybe, could be. But Long Lake is not just home to that aerial phenomenon. Benson also reported that 2 campers in 1989 were out on that lake when a giant black and yellow creature emerged from the water. It was approximated at 25 feet long with a head like a football. The creature was given the nickname Long Neck of Long Lake. So there's a plesiosaur in there too. Maybe it's transpermia from the aliens. Maybe it's something that's left over from the ice ages. I don't know. But over the years, many reports have trickled in of an eerie snake-like creature roaming Long Lake and breaking the placid waters. So now you got UFOs, you got alien bases, and you got cryptids right in that area.
Boom.
So the UFO Days Festival, it ran for 33 years until Bill's passing in 21, where the final UFO Days was held in 22. And that was an unofficial event that was more of a celebration of life for the departed Benson. So that is the Long Lake UFO capital.
Wow.
So this long neck creature living in Long Lake, how long was it before this creature was sighted, or when was this sighted again? I'm sorry if
this
I
was
the date.
No problem. It was first reported by 2 campers in 1989. That was the first official report that I found of it, and then it had been seen since then. And they said it was about 25 feet long with a head shaped like a football. And
when was this lake named before or after this sighting?
This would the lake was named before it, so it was Long Lake for a while, and then when this thing emerged, they're like, well, it had a long neck and it's in Long Lake. Let's call it Long Neck of Long Lake. It's rolls off the tongue.
Are there any indigenous stories of this area that you know of or that you're aware of?
Not specifically that area to lake monsters. If you go further west to the Devil's Lake, Wisconsin, there's been a sighting of a plesiosaur. And now to think of it, just north of there is Lake Winnebago, and that is home to its own sea creature. Surprisingly enough, I don't know of a lot of sea creature sightings in Lake Michigan, which would seem like that would be a fertile ground for them, but mostly it's inland lakes that I've found most of these reports.
Now, are these...
What is a plesiosaur?
Plesiosaur is I guess it is a dinosaur with a long neck and like flippers.
Think
and a long,
the Loch Ness
tail.
Monster.
Loch Ness Monster is considered a plesiosaur.
Oh, okay.
That's
Now, let me ask you this, Jeff. Are these lakes where these creatures are sighted, are boats allowed on these lakes, or are these reservoir type lakes that are protected from that kind of activity? Like, what's the regulations with these lakes?
So this specific lake is open to motorboating, and Bill Benson actually had a boat landing on there where a lot of people put in their boats. So the restaurant is shuttered, but you can still use their loading ramp for loading and unloading your boat.
I wonder how much that plays into these kind of environments. Maybe these creatures would be less likely to survive in a place that was being exposed to that much activity. I'm not to say that motorboats are necessarily polluting, but they are spitting gas and oil.
Disrupting.
They're disrupting, and there's certain types of boats that like dredge up the bottoms of the lake beds, and so I'm not against boating, but it is something. It's something that I would imagine.
Whoa, Mark! You're against boating.
I'm just saying.
I never knew that.
I don't want to piss any boaters off, but I'm just saying. Like, I'm sure the lakes that don't have boaters on it are more pristine and have more animals, more wildlife, just as a rule of thumb. I think that's safe to say.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say. And there are like Devil's Lake, where the other sighting is, that is a no wake lake. So you might be able to have like a small like trolling motor, but most everything is like paddleboard, canoe. And there's a lot of long held stories of a sea creature in that specific lake too. So as far as the long lake note goes, I don't think there's any regulations as far as motorboating, but Mercury Marine is actually out of Wisconsin, and Evinrude was invented in Wisconsin as well, the first commercially available boat motor. So I take deep offense to that, Mark.
Wow.
So as a Wisconsinite.
Damn, Wisconsin is just loaded with some stuff.
What are the general dimensions? On my uncle's boat. I love boating.
I know. I'm just giving you a hard time.
That's funny. What are the general dimensions of the lakes? Are they pretty deep? Are they?
I didn't really look into Long Lake as far as the acreage or depth of it, but from everything that I've read, it's not that big of a lake. Winnebago is just north of it, and that is the largest inland lake in Wisconsin, and it has its own legend. And then there's also another sea monster legend in kind of a back channel of the Mississippi River on the west side of the state, which is called Peppy. It's Lake Pepin. They call it the Lake Pepin monster, or Peppy for short, kind of like Nessie. So, looking at Wikipedia quick here, it looks like it is. Well, okay, that's actually the town. Anyways, I'll move on. But yeah, I don't think
so I like to ask questions sometimes.
It's a good question because it's like, is it big enough to habitate life of something like this? Probably not, but that doesn't discount that maybe there's a supernatural aspect to.
Or it could just, like the lakes themselves could be, holding just the key or one part of the doorway. If these are interdimensional creatures, they not necessarily maybe even living in the lake all the time, anytime. It's just one.
It manifests in the waters. Yeah.
If you scry at the right time on these lakes, you will thus.
You'll be able to peer into another dimension. And if you want to check out a great story, look up the Wisconsin Legends podcast on the legend of Devil's Lake and some of the Crowleyan sex magic rituals that happened within that lake that they think resulted in a sea monster type creature in there, kind of a Cthulhu type monster. Mm-hmm. Lurking Devil's Lake. So I'll tease that. You'll have to listen to that episode to learn more about that. All right. So we'll get to the last of the UFO capital, and then I only have a couple more slides for you guys tonight. So in 1987, a Belleville police officer, along with the Dane County Sheriff Deputy. So Dane County is the county that Madison is. Belleville is like a small bedroom community, just, I believe, southwest of Madison. Well, they witnessed lights in the sky along the town's south sky. Now, Glenn Casmer, a Belleville PD officer, was on night patrol when he witnessed a cluster of unmoving lights in the sky. Now, Casmer, he picked up his partner, Jeff Furseth, and drove to a bluff southwest of town. What they said they saw there, a mile or two south and 1,000 feet or so up, were flashing red, blue, and white lights arranged horizontally. The cluster was motionless and the lights were intense, more like spotlights than aircraft or running lights. Casmer said there was no sound and it was too dark to discern a shape. Now, they were later joined by other law enforcement officers. Eventually, the lights moved southwest, picked up speed, and then disappeared. So it wasn't like a planetary body that they saw. It wasn't like a cluster of stars. It actually started moving and then eventually disappeared. The reports attracted national attention from the incident, and then the report was the first of many for the Belleville, New Glarus area. And of course, the weirdness is commemorated every year with an annual parade, and that's usually held around Halloween. And like I said, it's very Wisconsin to take any occasion, any event, whether it was bratwurst or UFO sightings or a specific brewery and have a festival and hold a kegger. So it's no different with these UFO days. Each one kind of has a party involved in it. And it's just kind of fun to celebrate the weirder aspects of our history or kind of counter history. So that is it for the Wisconsin UFO capitals. Now, I teased you earlier that we were going to get to Roswell.
Yes.
And how it tied into Wisconsin.
Well, and before we get there, I do want to just say something just came to me. Wisconsin is known as the Badger State, but its other nickname is America's Dairyland. And I just, as that hit me, I'm like, oh wow, of course. What do UFOs always get associated with? Cattle mutilation. So of course, the state with all these dairy cows is going to have UFOs going on. And, you know, if that's something that they're interested in, yeah, that would be their, you know, land of abundance, their land of milk and dairy.
Yeah, and that's funny because in that last Long Lake story, they talked about the UFOs scaring a herd of cattle. Cattle mutilations, surprisingly, I don't have a lot of reports of. Which is interesting considering the abundance of dairy cattle in the state. So that's go ahead.
I wonder if maybe they're not interested in dairy cows because it does, as you said, that it does seem like a lot of the cattle mutilation reports come out of places
beef cattle
where they have beef cattle. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was looking up earlier because, unlike Mark, I had that thought in the beginning of the podcast. No, I'm just playing. But I was curious. I was like, oh yeah, no, of course, Wisconsin's got all this cow or this cheese situation stuff going on, and I was surprised to see that it's ninth in the country for population of cows. Texas being number one. But when it comes to dairy cows, they are right behind California, which I don't know if anybody's ever driven right down the I-5 and just are doing that. They're making some crazy tax write-off. Really fascinating. The cows. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Cows are amazing. You guys are amazing. Please continue with your wonderful slides and your great presentation, Jeff.
Oh, we loved what you're saying. You just lagged so hard. It sounded like you got slowed down. Your time.
I thought maybe you were abducted by a space alien.
I may be slow, but your connection is lagging, dude.
Yeah. But we were able to understand it, and yes,
we heard you.
Considering the landmass, Wisconsin does have a lot of cows. Maybe not as many as California and Texas, but we're up there as far as dairy production goes. But to round it out, the 1990s, they were primed for UFOs. In 1993, the iconic hit TV series, The X-Files, premiered. Shortly thereafter, a Showtime film debuted titled Roswell. It was based on Wisconsin investigator Don Schmitt's book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. Now, in 1986, Schmitt went to New Mexico to investigate the now famous supposed flying saucer crash at Roswell that happened in 1947. Now, Don, he was confident that he would just spend a weekend there, debunk it, and leave. Now, Schmitt, he was shocked to learn about what he found. Now, he was able to compile 550 witness testimonials, and from people seeing everything from the actual debris or wreckage on Mac Brazzo's field to some actually witnessing the dead alien bodies. Now, he wrote that up in the book, The Truth About the Crash at Roswell, and that was then spun off into this movie that premiered on Showtime called Roswell. Now, so it may have been Stanton Friedman in the 60s who went out to Roswell and wrote kind of the comprehensive report on the Roswell crash when it was still fresh in people's minds. But the person responsible for maybe bringing Roswell to the zeitgeist in popular culture was Don Schmitt with his book about the UFO crash. And Don Schmitt, he actually worked with the esteemed Dr. Hynek at CUFOS, and he actually had a separate branch in Milwaukee where he worked, perpetuated that field of investigation. So just one more tie-in to Wisconsin with UFOs. And then finally, we get to the modern day. So everybody saw it over the summer, July 26, 2023, the House Oversight and Accountability Subcommittee hearing on UFOs was held on Capitol Hill. This was the famous testimony of David Grush. So what does this have to do with Wisconsin? Well, the committee was chaired by U.S. Representative Glenn Grothman, Republican congressman from Wisconsin. So it said in some reports after the hearings that he found Grush less credible than some of the other witnesses that were called into question over the incidents, but he had called for a little more transparency from the military when it came to historical UFO crashes. And then he also supported a bipartisan amendment to the defense budget, which would require declassification of military documents on UAPs no later than 25 years. Grothman went on record to say he thought maybe 15 years would be a more likely target as far as releasing this information. Although this may be appreciated by people like me that like to revel in the ufology in the lore. But it's likely that most of the research and development and anything that's been recovered or created from any of this alien technology, otherworldly technology, or stuff that we can't quite place it as genuine, American ingenuity, is kind of siphoned up and cordoned off to private sectors to circumvent those pesky FOIA requests. So although he wants more oversight of this, like government departments always do, the reality of actually getting that, I feel, is pretty flimsy at best. But it was interesting to see that even in the modern times in ufology, Wisconsin is still playing a role with Grothman being the chair of that committee.
What's the name of this committee?
It was called the House Oversight and Accountability Subcommittee hearing on UFOs.
Wow.
And that was chaired by. So I
look at this guy's smile.
Well, so the funny thing is about this character here, David Grush. I know he just was on Rogan last week or a couple weeks ago, and I haven't had a chance to watch the episode yet. But when I went for a Google image search of him, they made him look as crazy as possible, which makes me think, okay, maybe this guy is credible after all, if they have to paint him in this crazy light just to kind of deflect. So it's interesting. I'm not sure where I come down on him. I don't know if these are two warring factions of government kind of going back and forth over technology and disclosure, that maybe David Grush is playing for one segment of the team, and then there's another segment of the team that's trying to obscure what they actually know. I'm not sure where I come down on this. I know I listened to the two gentlemen standing right behind him, George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell. I don't know if you can see them seated. Jeremy's got the green shirt, and George has the black suit with the red tie. They were on Rogan talking about this, and they made a compelling case for this Grush character. So I'm not really sure what to make about all of these modern UFO revelations, but it's intriguing nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly. And just to back up what you're saying, a lot of characters I've looked into in research when you find them being, placed as disheveled or having only just crazy photos of them online or available to find. It's because there is a lot of times a specific narrative being painted about them, and yeah, like you can't find just like a normal, just smiling photo. This I can't get over this. I've zoomed in on this guy's face like 7 times right here in the middle.
Just drop David Grusch, Grusch, into a Google image search, and you'll see all of the rubber face photos of him, and it feels like an attempt to discredit him as a kooky crank or a crackpot. But if you listen to him, it's like a lot of the stuff he's saying is plausible. I don't know if it's disinformation, misinformation. I'm not sure what to make of him, to be quite honest with you, but it's intriguing.
Yeah.
So,
one more thing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, yeah, you go right ahead.
I was saying on that slide you had just before this with the Roswell TV movie, I'd never heard of that or seen that. I'm gonna watch it because I love Kyle MacLachlan because, Twin Peaks. Yep. He was one of David Lynch's like favorite actors. He was in Blue Velvet. He was in all the Twin Peaks. He was in almost every single David Lynch movie besides Eraserhead. And so I'm like, ooh, with Martin Sheen, I was like, I could waste some time watching this movie.
There was a lot of big names in this. I looked at the IMDb here, and who was the yeah, I got it right up here. Let me grab it. If I can get back to it. Yeah.
This is in his prime time too, just 4 years after Twin Peaks was aired.
Yeah, so Kyle MacLachlan played Jesse Marcel. He was the guy that recovered the wreckage and showed it to his son. Martin Sheen played Townsend. I'm not sure how he played in. Dwight Yoakam played Mac Brazel. So I was like, all right, maybe that was his first. I'm not sure if 94 was his kind of debut. I know he did Friday Night Lights and he did a couple other parts. Sling Blade, but Dwight Yoakam is kind of a compelling character. But yeah, it's worth taking a look at. I'm not sure how it holds up 30 years on, but it's interesting how that was spun off into kind of the popular zeitgeist of the era. So there you have it, from airship sightings, citizen research, to the father of ufology, to space pancakes, lake monsters, Roswell, modern UAP hearings. Wisconsin has been the forefront when it comes to ufology.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, thank you for putting this together. Now,
great presentation, brother.
Yeah, I want to add a little bit of the native perspective. I don't remember, and please remind me if we did, talk about the Native Americans when you first joined us on Esoteric America, but the Winnebago tribe is on the sort of eastern half of Wisconsin, at least going back before the settlers moved in. And one of their legends, and again, if we already talked about this, forgive me, but Menominee,
Menominee, yep.
Yeah, Menominee has this really interesting vision at Lake Michigan, which they called the Bad Lake for some reason. And that's kind of interesting. But he said that the chief commanded that all manner of supplies be assembled at a white sand beach on Lake Michigan. And when all this had been done and set in order, as the sun reached its zenith, the vision came to life. In the pure blue sky of the eastern horizon, a single dark cloud began to form and move irresistibly towards them. It was a great flock of ravens, spirit birds with rainbow plumage of iridescent colors. The instant that the first of these landed, he materialized into a naked, kneeling man. The Menominee chief said to his people, "Give this man clothing, for he is a chief." And the others landed in like fashion and were given great hospitality. They were the Hokaak Nation, and that is how they came to the Red Banks. So here we go, right at the beginning.
Okay, no, we did not cover this, Mark, and this is...
isn't that awesome? Like, this is
that
like
is great.
a UFO visitation going on.
Yeah. Can you spell the last word you said? H-O.
Oh, it's the Ho Chunk or
Okay,
Ho
Ho
Cha.
Chunk. Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I thought. It's like a Hotchkach or something. I'm not sure how to
Yeah,
pronounce it
yeah.
in their actual tongue, but yeah, they are known as the Ho Chunk Indians now,
Right.
and they are the Indians that are native
But
to
then
the
if you
Madison area, and they believe them to be the ancestral lineage or descendants of the mound builders.
Okay, wow. See, that's incredible.
But
And
but I've never heard that myth about them um, being created from a flock of, did you say ravens or
well,
blackbirds
it
or?
seems like they flew in from the sky and appeared to be ravens, and when they landed, they materialized into men,
Mhm.
or men and women. It says, and that's how they came to the Red Bank. So, I mean, when I think of a raven, especially the coloration, I mean, it kind of reminds me of what people describe UFOs looking like, where you have like this iridescence, almost like an oil slick or like a CD-ROM, right? When you look at it, when the light's
Yep.
reflecting on it, you see this
The
prismatic
iridium, yeah.
effect. Yep. So I wonder, maybe raven or spirit bird became, a sort of translation over time for something that initially meant, just something that flew and looked, or had similar
It was their
qualities to a raven.
contextualization of
Yeah, yeah.
technology that they didn't understand.
Well, that's one way of putting it. Or they just, over time, like the similarity of descriptive words blended together.
Okay.
Like these
So
things
so like okay.
that
Yeah, so they had no other way to
well,
pass down bound it than by using something of the natural world.
or just like the qualities that are associated with a raven were also associated with this,
Okay.
and over
All right.
time, because of their natural like language, that like those sorts of organic terms were preferred and became like because that's one thing, and it doesn't this isn't true for every native language, but from what I've been learning about native languages, there's a lot of words that mean multiple things within context. So
Mhm.
out of context, you may think that they're just talking about a raven, but within the story, there may be other words that indicate that it's actually just one aspect of what it means to be a raven, not the physical bird itself. They're using raven as a descriptive kind of word in that context. So, again, I like, not to take anything away from the mythology. Maybe raven isn't meant to be any of what I just described, and it's meant to be sincerely a raven, as
A
in the
literal,
bird.
yeah.
But I think this paired with what you just presented is really incredible. I'm glad that I decided, just kind of came to me to look at the map here of Wisconsin tribes, and then when I looked up Winnebago, this Ho Chunk mythology came up, and there's more here too. But Thunderbird is also mentioned. Redhorn maybe is somebody who we talked about, because that does
I
sound
believe Chad has
familiar.
talked about this giant red horn. I think
Okay,
yeah,
maybe
he
that's
covered
where
that,
it's
but I'd not
familiar.
heard that origin myth of the Ho
Menominee.
Chek or the Ho Chunk people, or yeah, they were formerly called the Winnebago people.
Cool. Wow.
Yeah, so I'm glad you shared that with me, because I'm always excited to learn something new about the natives of the land that I live in now.
No doubt. Yeah, no, and that's a big part of this show. Esoteric America includes, everything that's happened on this land, and, not in a corny social justice warrior kind of way. I'm all about acknowledging the Native Americans and acknowledging that this is their land, and yeah, I think that's a big part of this show is trying to connect all of the different nodal points that make up this very, very complex story that is American history. And so much of it is esoteric. And that's why, having a guest like yourself at our disposal is so awesome, because, let's be honest, I can't go all the way out to Wisconsin right now. I do plan on it. That's something that makes this show so cool, is now we're connecting with people all across the state and all across the country for when we do branch out and do a little road trip
Yeah.
But yeah, we can't do it alone. And it's awesome to have you on the show, Jeff. So
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. Enjoyed, diving deeper in this, and then uncovering a few things I didn't know about my state or the field of ufology,
right.
namely, some of Hynek's esoteric background, that specific near abduction along that starship in 1897. So I appreciate the challenge and being able to learn more about this. So if you want to learn more about the Wisconsin's history of UFOs, we did a 2 hour. It's broken up into 2 1 hour episodes of the Wisconsin Legends podcast. The second episode just dropped last week, so that's ready for your viewing pleasure.
Right on. Right
Yep.
on.
And you can find me Instagram at Badgerland Legends, or all the socials, or else if you're on Facebook, go to the Wisconsin Legends group on Facebook and ask for an invite.
Right on. Yeah.
Check it out.
Definitely go and support Jeff. Check out Wisconsin Legends. Even if you don't live in Wisconsin, it's a great podcast to listen to. Maybe you're going to travel to Wisconsin one day. It's a great start. I think, again, going back to why I love doing this show so much and why we're going to continue doing it, even though we haven't been putting out regular episodes, is because it's so exciting to have like a travel guide based around this sort of thing. Like, before this episode, I wouldn't have known that Wisconsin is a potential UFO hotspot. And I should have asked you, maybe it's too late to ask, but I wonder if there's like a pattern to when these UFOs appear. Like, are they, more often sighted in the summertime, more often sighted in the wintertime? Again, I'm thinking like a tourist, like, when can I go to Wisconsin to see what's the best time of year to see UFOs in Wisconsin? I don't think you necessarily have an answer to that question, but that's a good factor to consider, future UFO researchers out there. Jeff, yourself, I'm going to consider it as I look into this subject further.
Yeah, to kind of answer your question there, I think probably the majority of them would be viewed during summer when more people are outside, which would just be more natural because it gets cold here in Wisconsin and nobody wants to be out. But ironically, I had my own sighting in February of all months, and it's coming up on the 20-year anniversary of that. So if you want to hear about my sighting, you'll have to listen to the second episode of the podcast to get that.
Cool. Well,
I will say I really enjoy your boys' research. You guys do really good, deep, thorough research, and have a great, articulate way of debriefing everything that you guys have looked up, and then it's just a great show. So just to back up what Mark was saying, and to go support Jeff, like, even if you don't live in Wisconsin, it's still going to be a great, high quality podcast to check out. So definitely do it, y'alls.
Well, and that's what makes doing these kind of shows so great, is like, even if you don't live in the place that we're talking about, this is a great sort of educational guide to even start doing this research yourself, But yeah, Jeff, awesome work. You're always crushing it. I'd love to have your co-host on at some point as well.
Yeah, we'll get Mike plugged in here as well.
I'm
sure
why is he always dodging the bullet?
Let us know when he, we'll know, when the Shaver deep dive comes out, in whatever form it comes out, because I'd love to go into that if you guys would both join us on the show for that.
So that is Dean Bertram.
Oh, okay.
And that is theshavermystery.com if you want to learn more about that. He has a film fest coming up in Eau Claire in March, and it's called the Midwest Weird Fest, where he will be premiering that. So I'll definitely put the bug in his ear. I think you can listen to him on the Untold Radio Network on a program called Talking Weird, where he goes into a lot of this stuff, and he's really at the forefront of the Shaver mystery and the Ray Palmer stuff. And Dean, he is a native Australian, but he found himself living in the North Woods of Wisconsin. And that's kind of where I discovered him, was like, what is this Aussie doing up in North Woods of Wisconsin? And then I found out about his project and kind of made fast friends with him. Cool. And he is a deep pool of ufology. He is a PhD in American history, of all things, from Sydney University in Australia, and has done a ton of research on the history of American UFO belief. So he is a clearinghouse of that content. So I definitely will set him up with you the closer we get to.
Yeah.
Cool.
And maybe he can do a little Esoteric America from his perspective, because I would be interested to see that.
Right on. All right. Put your lighters in the air for Wisconsin. Right. And until next time, folks, thanks for exploring Esoteric America with us, one state at a time. Big shout out to Wisconsin Legends Podcast. It is linked in the description. Go and find out about Jeff's own personal firsthand encounter with a UFO, right? A UFO, you said?
That's right. UFO sighting.
Okay, I was just making sure it wasn't a lake monster, because we did talk about those two today. There's much more to come, so stay tuned and look out for the next episode of Esoteric America here on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast feed, also on Romans Rising from the Ashes feed, and of course, if you're listening on the audio, the video is available on Rockfin and YouTube, so go there and support the show if you want to see some of the amazing slides that Jeff shared today. And until next time, happy trails.